Hello, in this video I'm going to show an example of an application that's using Angular JS and Ionic as a mobile framework for building applications in Worklight. If you're familiar with Worklight, you will see that we have examples using technologies like Dojo Mobile, jQuery Mobile, and Sencha Touch. Worklight is an open platform and can support many types of frameworks. Examples of those are Backbone, Handlebars, etc. can be used in Worklight applications. Let me show you an example. Here I have a backend application that's really just stub data, simulating some type of backend, and it's just really JSON data. So I have some accounts for a particular user, and then I have some transaction data that I've stubbed out. I've run this inside a WebSphere application server, version 8.5 Liberty Profile, and it's going to emulate a backend, an API system, etc. Here I have a Dorado Bank project, and I have a set of Worklight adapters, or one Worklight adapter. Worklight adapter basically calls the backend stub service that I just talked about, with two adapter methods, get accounts and get transactions. It also simulates Worklight authentication. Here I have adapter-based authentication, really hard coding a user ID and password. This is so that the mobile developer writing the client piece of the application can easily work and emulate the proper behavior on the client side with security. So here, if you want to deploy the adapter, just right-click, run as deploy Worklight adapter, and it'll deploy it on the test Worklight server. Let's examine the client-side application. Under Apps, I have the Dorado Bank application. Using the optimization framework, most of the code is written in the Commons folder, which means for any environment like the iPhone or something else like Android, this application will have shared resources in the common folder when you build a particular environment. Let's open the index file. You see this is an HTML file, and over here I have some JavaScript that I bring in. One, the Ionic bundle, which includes Angular JS as a model view controller framework, as well as an additional Angular package called routes, which allows me to scale the application by dividing up resources so a development team can use that. Here I have a set of scripts. I bring in my application layer, my services. This is a layer of JavaScript which interacts with the backend adapters, some logic around my menu, my accounts, and my login. You could use a framework like Require.js to load these resources instead. That might be more efficient. However, for this example, I'm just focusing on Angular and Ionic. If you're familiar with Angular, and I'll put some links in the written portion of this blog, you will see that Angular uses attributes within HTML to point to different parts of the application. It is a template-based framework. And so, for example, I have a menu controller that is scoped to the body of the application. I have a login controller that I bootstrap here as well. If you're familiar, there's another attribute called ngapp, and ngapp you would use to wrap the whole application. However, because Worklight has its own startup process, instead of wrapping the application and the tags with ngapp, I bootstrapped it programmatically within the Worklight loading, and I'll show that momentarily. You see here I have then Ionic menus. I have standard things like header bars. I have some content, an ngview, which will host kind of the content I load from the different parts of the application. I have a tabbed interface, so Ionic has some tab widgets that you can bring in. Again, they're all CSS3 based. And I have a side menu as well that I bring in. And you notice that I add behavior by using Angular JS attributes. ngClick in this case calls a method called tab select, which is inside my menu controller. So after I load Ionic, one of the first things I do is load the app. Let's take a look at that. Well, before I go into the app, down on the bottom here, these are the standard scripts that are included by Worklight. Main would be where Worklight initializes. And within the main method, WL common init is the callback that gets invoked when Worklight is loaded. And here is where I use Angular's API to load the Angular app onto the document. So this would scope Angular to the whole page. Next, let's take a look at the app.js file. A couple things we do. We use the factory method in Angular to just create a wrapper for the busy indicator. This allows us to inject the busy indicator into different controllers in Angular. You see here we create an app using the ng routes, and we bring in Ionic as well. Ionic is the widget framework. ng routes is an additional Angular plugin that allows you to create routes in your application. With the route provider, we use the route provider.when to say whenever we go to a URI that ends in accounts, a pound account, load the template for accounts.html and the account controller for that as well. And we do that for the account details. Notice here that I can go to a specific account ID which will be injected into the detail controller, and I'll show that momentarily. And then we have the rest of the routes, which are just stubbed out templates, placeholders for future functionality in the application. But this allows us to divide up the application into different pages and controllers that different developers can work on. And it's a good way to keep code modular and separated. Next, let's take a look at the actual templates that was loaded by the router. Accounts is what's going to be loaded first. And the accounts is a Angular template with Ionic widgets within it. So for example, here you see a refresher widget. That's the standard pull down that you see in mobile apps. In this case, from the controller that it's bound to, if you remember, we loaded an account controller with the account HTML file. We'll call get accounts to refresh. We're using standard tags within an Angular template. So here we're looping through the accounts that are returned, which will be scoped to this page, and I'll talk about that momentarily. And it will render specifics about the account as well as a link to the account detail service. And if you look more specifically, you will see that we can also call helpers that, for example, will format currency. Under the JavaScript, I have a controllers folder, and we can take a look at the account controller. The account controller is defined using Angular's controller method off the app, and this function gets invoked when the controller is loaded and passes the scope. You can think of the scope as the data for that template, that page. And we also pass in an account service, which represents a proxy to the back end, as well as the busy indicator we talked about earlier. So here we define our getAccounts method. That's the method that you saw that gets called. From the refresh widget, we show the busy indicator, and then we say account service, which will invoke the back end and get us account data, or it could actually get it from some local cache, etc. The key is to abstract the call to the back end using a service, and we'll show that service momentarily. We use a then, which will get invoked when we have the data from the back end, and we will attach the accounts to the scope of the page. We send a broadcast that tells refresh is complete for the refresh case, and we hide the busy indicator from Worklight, which is an abstraction to the actual native busy indicator. We also call getAccounts the first time we load the page. Let's now look at the services. We injected an account service. In the services folder, I have a services.js file, and you see that there's an account service that I create. And what I do here is I use the Worklight API for invoking adapters. And so you see I invoke a procedure to get account that I showed earlier. There's a similar one for getting specific transactions The interesting part about the transaction is it has this route parameter in which we pick off the ID off the URI so that we could pass the account ID for specific transactions. And so it's very simple services tier, and it can be used to abstract from your controllers. Now, looking back at the adapter, the accounts and the transactions adapter procedure method is secured by a security test, which will invoke the submit authentication call that we just talked about. If you remember from our HTML page back in the apps, the main page, I loaded a login controller to Bootstrap there. So let's take a look at that login controller, because when you invoke the service, it will kick in authentication. And so what we've done is we've built a login controller that will have the standard Worklight security callbacks that you need to code on the client side. In the written part of the blog, I put links into Worklight security framework, but when you get a challenge from the back end, it will automatically go and use Ionic modal box, and from a template login page URL, it will load the correct login page, and then you can go ahead and submit that authentication. I just put this call right within the controller for now for simplicity, but you will create the challenge handler and you will submit the login when available. The login page is just another view. You can view that here as well, and it will get automatically invoked when you do that. Notice it is using Ionic widgets. We're using an Ionic header bar and different Ionic widgets, as well as Angular templates. So the login page itself is an Angular template. Very similarly, in the accounts controller, you have the account detail controller, which basically calls the transaction service, which we saw earlier. Because I'll be logged in already, once I get the list of accounts, I'll be able to navigate to the account detail page. That view is an accounts detail.html. Also using the Ionic refresher widget to get the accounts detail, as well as rendering each of the transactions with the particular data items. So that gives you a view into an application that's using Angular and Ionic. The key thing with Worklight, as a reminder, is really when you bootstrap Worklight. Let me get that HTML file. When Worklight bootstraps and Worklight loads, once Worklight loads, then we go ahead and load Angular. There's different techniques to this, but this is the one that I found has worked best. Let's now run the example. So if I say run as deploy Worklight adapter, you will see that my Worklight adapter is deployed into the Worklight development server. Remember, I already have a running stub service. This is a standard WAR file. For WebSphere Liberty, you could just install this on a regular WebSphere Liberty profile. Now that the back end is set up, let's run this in preview mode. And preview will allow you to run this within a browser. So here it's launched it in my Chrome browser. Notice the login page prompts me, so I'll just go ahead and log in. Barcia Blowfish. And you see that it renders the application. I get the Dorado list. I can go and navigate to a detail. My navigation to the different placeholders work. And I have a more widget that shows you some animation, and you can click contact us and you see that we have a running application in preview mode. Next, let's run this on the Xcode iOS simulator. So I'll say run as Xcode project, and what that will do is actually launch the Xcode project. Then I can go ahead and play that right in the iOS simulator. You will see the application launches in the iOS simulator, and you see that I get the login page. and you get the transaction history. You can see the pull to refresh, which will refresh the data. Same here. Pull to refresh, and it will re-get the data from the back end. You see that I have the animation for the background menu, and the navigation completely works. Lastly, I will push this to a real device. You see here that I pushed it to my iPhone. So when I press play, I have here, I'm projecting my iPhone onto the screen, and it will launch the application. And I'm actually using this on my phone, and it will render the login screen. So I will log in, same password, blowfish. Oh, and I mistyped my password. Let me try this again. This is teaching me that I can't spell. So there we go. We've logged in. You see I can do the pull to refresh. I can get the specific details. You see the loading indicator from Worklight. I can navigate through the page, and I can click the more, and you see that this is running on a real device, and it's using Angular JS, Worklight, Ionic, and it just goes to show you the openness of the platform. This was not meant to be a tutorial on any of the frameworks, but really showing the pieces working together. You can go to the Getting Started page for Worklight. You can Google Worklight Getting Started to really see how to, for example, do the authentication, build out different Worklight environments, etc. Ionic is the framework we used. It's a beta-based framework, so keep that in mind. It's not an endorsement per se that this is the best framework out there. It is, from what I'm seeing, a beta level tool. It's CSS3 based, and it has a lot of potential. It is Angular based. Of course, solutions like jQuery Mobile, Sencha Touch, and Dojo Mobile are all very good solutions as well. You can create hybrid mobile apps using HTML5, and they perform pretty well. And of course, Angular JS is a well-known model view controller framework based on templates. And so check these things out. I will also provide a zip file with a project archive that you can load into Eclipse.